All right, good morning. And in the interest of time, we'll get started. We're extremely honored and so proud to have James here today with us. James did his Bachelor Arts training at the University of Cambridge, followed by his medical school at the University of Oxford, and then further training at the Imperial College of London, and then CMR training with Roy Brompton with Professor Dudley Pannell. And it is an interesting story that at that time also our own John Lester was happened to be classmates or training together. That's a very nice serendipity that happens. Jason is currently the professor of cardiology at UCL, University College in London, and the clinical director of imaging at the largest cardiovascular hospital center, Bart's Heart Center, which serves a population of about 6 million individuals. He is former member of the NICE Technology Appraiser, past president of the British Society of Cardiovascular Magnetic Resonance, founder of the London CMR, and importantly, the T1 mapping group, which has really changed and brought colors to MRI, but beyond those colors, a lot of things I'm very excited to hear about. His focus has been on the myocardial biology and how we can use the MR camera to understand better the biological processes, stratification, patient selection, and a lot of also artificial intelligence that will help us to also not only but also discover new processes. He's the author of more than 350 papers, PubMed publications, and really a key opinion leader. And really, thankful for him to make a detour to the cold Minneapolis. Thank you very much, and welcome, James.
Thank you, Jao. It's great to be here. I think we sort of planned this when we were in Brazil together in Sao Paulo, and it's lovely to have come up. I'm at a conference in Orlando, so just detoured up here. So our international meeting, which we'll be at next week, in fact, I think we're going to be having some AS amyloid meetings, will be on Wednesday. So I'm going to sort of setting out a stall a bit, taking you back a bit to what I think about the heart. And apologies for treating you like undergraduates, but I do like to think about what the heart is for. And this is my list, and I don't think most people think in adult disease about this. So your heart has to be built, and it has to work while it's being built in embryogenesis, so cardiomorphogenesis. And it then has to have a toolkit for growing to your adult size. And I think the evolutionary pressures are for it to be efficient at rest. And we're not very good at measuring efficiency of the heart. I don't have the ability to measure the power output of the heart. And yet it still has to be fight or flight with a high output at stress. So there may be a tension between those two. And it has to adapt. It has to adapt to pregnancy and to disease. And those myocytes, even if they don't divide, can sense their environment and shape the interstitium around them, and in fact, how you think, and your kidneys and things, because it's a hormonal organ. And then, of course, we can scale the body from a mouse, the mammalian heart, from a mouse to a whale. So there is within you an evolutionary toolkit, and your heart's contractile apparatus is walking along a tightrope through evolution. Dinosaurs will have had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and we can all fall off one side or another. We're under evolutionary pressure, and the heart is highly conserved. But I think we're in trouble as cardiologists. We are being left behind by cancer, and it's quite easy not to notice that because we sit often in a single building, not necessarily attached to the main hospital. A lot of cardiology research is in dedicated institutes, and when we do interact, it might be in a specific domain of, say, cardio-oncology. But we are shuttered off to what other bits of society is doing. Our measurements are not very good. We describe the heart in a sort of 1970s way by how thick it is and how big it is and how much it squeezes. That is nothing to do with pathways. We don't reach all our patients, and by any means, we don't standardize particularly well. And imaging is not very well, or our measurement biology is not linked to therapy. Diseases like DCM and HOCM are crude groups, and yet, and we typically treat everyone with the same drugs. And imaging, for example, even within the clinical, it's all siloed quite tightly. Going deeper into that, cardiology is an emergent problem with cancer survivorship and mitigation of deaths, acute sudden cardiac deaths in many scenarios. We don't have a single precision therapy for heart muscle. Now, you could start to argue about some of the infiltrations, amyloid, Fabry's, iron, but they're slightly systemic, if you like. We don't have a treatment for myocyte. We marinate, you marinate your patients in ACE inhibitors and beta blockers, which are really neurohormonal drugs. And actually, our phase 3 studies are not very effective. I don't know if any of you worked on many phase 3 studies, but your chance of success is about 1 in 30 on those for a drug that will then be delivered as standard care. What cardiology diseases do we cure? There are not many. Patent ductus, some ablations for flutter, for example, but mainly we control. And actually, this is a beautiful building, but if you look at investments in cardiology versus, for example, cancer, we are really falling behind, and our pipeline of drugs is quite thin. And you can see some other aspects there. So, for example, if you were, bragging about your biomarkers for the heart, BNP and troponin, seriously, just 2. Cancer is becoming a blood test diagnosis. The imaging is really fading into the background. So we've got a problem. So we need to start thinking about the heart at in multiple scales and try and start to think of what of our classifications should we reject. And yes, that is the basics of clinical practice, talking to patients, the ECG, the genomics, which is transforming all we do. Still, we don't have a good, the heart is locked away in the chest and we do not biopsy it enough. And the reason we don't biopsy it enough is because we're not very good at actioning what we see there. And therefore, we don't biopsy enough. So there's a vicious cycle about what to do with the data and how we would actually go ahead and do that. So, I mean, if you've done a cardiac biopsy, the techniques you're using are 30 years old. So that is not black and white TVs, it's color TVs, and it's still in the mobile phone era, but it is a 30-year-old device that you put inside people's hearts and tear bits of myocardium out. And then I'm just alluding to more sophisticated ways of structure and function. So we're not good at integrating data. We need to think about the heart at all scales. So here are 2 myocytes. You can see the top one beating normally. That sort of 10% alteration in length is converted into cardiac output. And you can see that the bottom myocyte is actually beating. It's actually in time because they're 2 videos of the same length. But that's a tightened heart. So we have to think about the myocytes, but it's not the myocytes that build the heart. I think we think of it as the myocytes, but actually it's 2 specialized cells, one for delivering a function, which is the myocyte in the heart, and one to supply the infrastructure, the roads, the networks, the oxygen and moving waste products, which is the capillary. So it's a myocyte capillary pair that forms the basis of any organ and heart muscle. And those things are coordinated into complex structure to deliver force. These are pictures we've created from episcopic microscopy using approaches to look at fiber orientations. And you can see in a mouse embryo the disruption with sarcomeric protein. So this is disarray in utero, for example. And then if you zoom in and out at every scale, this is a heart that with John Lesser was transplanted at Brompton back in 2001. This is the in vivo imaging, and it matches up. And we have to look at that at every scale. So you can see almost fractal nature of the architecture, right down to this picture where you can see the Z discs of the fundamental sarcomeric protein mutation. And the reason our imaging works so well, and yet the primary pathology is at the protein level, is, I think, best summarized by Richard Feynman, where nature uses only the longest threads to weave her pattern. So if you can look at one part of the thread, you can actually infer a much broader understanding of what's going on. So, and that was myocytes into architecture, but don't forget the capillaries. A lot of us think about the circulation of the heart from how far down we can stent it, but it's a circulation. Circulation has a meaning. It's not just the blood, the red cells go from the left ventricle all the way through and back via the right ventricle, etc. And if you disrupt these, then you will cause problems for the patient. And the architecture of the heart is poorly discovered, poorly defined. We don't even have a name for the branching patterns or the number of branches there are. A lot more to do and to translate into clinical care. I alluded to cardiomorphogenesis, so these are fetal hearts again. You can see that the heart on the left, on the screen right, is about a day and a half before the one on the other side. And this is the compaction process. And the heart has grown. And you can see we just had segmentation here, or septation, and here it's a much more compacted adult phenotype. So imaging underpins our cardiac care. How are we getting on? As I said, structure and function still describes and creates the brain pathways that you're using for your patients. So you know what this picture is. It's a sort of cartoon of how we think of the heart. But if you looked at that heart muscle, it could be very, very different in the different diseases. You've all seen DCMs that just sit there with an EF of 30% for 20 years, and yet others just go to transplant very, very swiftly. And yet by imaging, the morphologies can look the same. We've got an information gap and a description gap. And we don't do our basics very well. So here is a really old paper from 2000 showing that echo, MUGO, and CMR just measure differently. So you can see the same patients there described by 39%, 29%, 31, 24, 30. And yet you will have all asked, is the EF below or above 35%? I want to put an ICD in. And what you can see here is that the answer is, go and choose the test you want, and you'll get the answer you want. And the other thing you can do is just see the patient more often, because the natural variation in measurement will give you the answer you want. So we have to think a little bit about metrology, accuracy, and precision. And these are not very convincing to, they're concepts we actually use in daily life all the time, but we don't call them accuracy and precision. You know, we have a current account to work out whether I'm, going overdrawn or not. That's the precision bit, and the accuracy is the whole mortgage and the house and your, if you like. So when you see a patient for the first time, you want to know where that patient is on a sort of glide pathway, often stage 1, 2, 3, 4, perhaps something like that. And that's a sort of accuracy. But when we see them next, you want to know if they've got better or worse. And that's when your imaging interval change is what you want to know. And you need precision. Ideally, you want both, but precision is the one in many ways I want most. And we don't really assess the precision of our tests very well. In fact, we actually hide how bad our precision is. So here's a paper we've done recently where we took a bunch of people still having MUGO scans for EF. And because you put the tracer in, you can actually put them on the camera twice. So we put them on the camera twice, and then we put them in the MRI scanner twice, and we did echo twice. Each patient had 4 of those tests. It wasn't reasonable to do 6 tests in a day. And we did about 80 patients. And then we measured the precision of what we do in everyday life. And these are the results. But I just want you to look at let's just take the sort of yellowy square on EF. So the coefficient of variation of echo is about 9%. Now, your definition, for example, of cardiotoxicity is 10% change, and your measurement precision is 9%. How on earth can you be diagnosing cardiotoxicity when your test has 9%? You can see that 3D is a bit better when you get the good images. MRI is a bit better, and MUGO was better than I really expected it would be, actually. But the result there is that 2D echo really can't be used for a key thing that we want to do in cardiology. It's not good enough, but then the others aren't very good either. What about LVH? So a lot of people measure wall thickness, HOCM. It's key for diagnosis, key for risk stratification. Let's see how good people are. So we took 10 perfect echo data sets and 10 perfect CMR data sets on the same patient. And we got those from about, we called for those sets from about 15 centers around the world, actually 20 centers, but we ended up using 10. And we took this to various conferences and asked 69 self-described experts whose decisions influence clinical care to measure wall thickness. And these are pairs. You've got CMR and echo, but let's just take a case like this. Here you can see that the average wall thickness measured by people was 2.3, 2.4 centimeters, but some of them measured 1 centimeter and some of them measured 4 centimeters. I mean, the scatter was completely crazy. We couldn't agree within about 8 millimeters on what the wall thickness was in the heart. The experts were really loathed doing this because that's the conclusion. Wall thickness measurement is unacceptable as a clinical test. You simply cannot base any therapy on it, and yet it's key to determining risk stratification, gradient reduction therapy, and the diagnosis. Or, of course, the global experts aren't the ones doing it. Or, of course, you're not measuring wall thickness. You're looking at the whole heart, thinking about the ECG, thinking about the family history, thinking about some unconscious biases, and making a decision as to whether or not to put them into the ICD category or not. Now, can we do better? So AI is changing the world, and it's changing the world very fast. The world is going to be run by geeks, and if you're not in that category, get there. This is learnable, and you should learn it. Medicine is lagging. There's lots of specific problems about medicine that make it difficult to deploy AI. But it's really good, and actually AI is really good for one thing particularly, and that's image classification and segmentation. And there are large data sets that have now done this, which have been labeled, and you can see that CNN, convolutional neural network approaches, now exceed human performance in pretty much all the things they're measured to do that in. Now, imaging is no different. So cardiac imaging or radiology is no different. This, if we could find the way of training and then deploying and proving performance, really should beat human performance. And this is a revolution driven by multiple issues. It's insights from neuroscience, it's the compute power, it's the data availability and sharing, how we're starting to share. And then these new computer languages, which are completely amazing. How many of you can code in any language at all? Put your hand up if you've ever scripted something in Python. So 3 people, which is 4 people, 5 people, which is more than most audiences. The problem is in medicine, we're mostly 20 years out of university, plus 20 plus by the time you're standing here very often or making the decisions. And these new languages, some of the newest languages are 2 years old, or 3 years old. Our sort of principle of go to school, go to university, and then work for the rest of your life till you retire is not an adequate thing. So I think there's something about lifelong learning and how we structure what we do that it needs to change. That's the GPU power. And that is an AI network, those 15 lines in TensorFlow, a two-layer network on random data with some loss and some back propagation. And that is all it is. It's incredibly high level and actually quite approachable to learn. So we really could start to learn the language to communicate with the computer scientists and to deliver them the problems and what you want to change this. But it requires us coming out of our comfort zones. Segmentation and classification is amazing by these tools. These are the sort of things happening in the background of your phone whilst you're sitting there on Facebook and things. Have you ever wondered why you get an advert for beachwear when you just when somebody sent you a picture of a holiday with someone on a beach? It's they're labeling the images in your Instagram and things and working out what to target you with. And we can do the same with imaging, medical imaging. Take a picture of this if you want. These are my favorite resources. Start with the 3 blue, 1 brown. They're just the most beautiful YouTube videos, and then move to the Stanford lectures. I recommend taking notes and going through them quite slowly if you want to. That would take you about 15 hours to Stanford if you really want to get into this. So progress is fast. So competitions are really important. So there was this Kaggle competition. We all like a competition, space race, SpaceX, that sort of competitions. And this was one to measure the ejection fraction. And it was won by 2 quants. So these are people who work in financial industries, know nothing about the heart. And they won this competition. And that was measuring the ejection fraction against a human gold standard. Is that a good gold standard? We've already alluded to that it probably isn't. So we're going to move on to how we could get better than that. And that code, they won their $100,000 or whatever, and the code was open source, and at least 30 groups have started to do this. So this is the first one from the UK Biobank. Health, 5,000 patients, very easy, clean, because it's a single magnet, perfectly done on compliant healthy volunteers. And then we moved it on to a single disease, but multi-center. This was aortic stenosis, and AS is thick hearts, thin hearts, dilated hearts, infarcts. It's quite a good one. That was in circ imaging. And we measured precision, so test, retest. So we scanned 110 patients twice at multiple institutions. Took us 2 years to get that data, and we started acquiring the data before we had the AI. So there's a certain degree of prediction of what you need to measure things. And what you can see here is if you take, say, let's take the ejection fraction. Human variation is intra-observer variation, inter-observer variation, and then the inter-scan variation. And the neural network always does the same thing on the same images. So the inter and intra-observer is gone, and then you've got the inter-scan variation. You can see that the mass there is beginning to look very close to being superior to a human in this test. So how would you go superhuman? So here's a neural network we've designed, and it's much more complicated. It's short axis measurement, then with a geometric merge for long axis, with a long axis done by post analysis. And this is done by Rodri, a computer scientist in my group, who won the UK's best PhD for medical imaging segmentation about 15 years ago, and then retrained to be a doctor. He's now a consultant cardiologist and a computer scientist able to do this. Not many of those around, so we have to find ways of using him to empower and engage two communities. So this was our target. This is the sort of AI segmentation we aim for. So what we did to do that was we got training data that was representative of global performance, any disease, any scanning platform. That's 1,900 cases, about 3 million images. We have to have a target, which was human performance. So at this stage, we didn't know if experts or trainees could do this. So we created a pipeline that went through me. So one expert segmented everything. So it's about 63,000 contours. And we fed those into the model and got the outputs. Now, if you want the output to be better than the input, seems like a neat trick. So what do? Input to model to output, and yet the output has to be better. So what we needed to understand was what the output was like, and so to interrogate that. And so that's what we did. And the test was, do these contours look plausible? And if not, why? And the amazing thing was that when the model did something wrong, you could see what it did wrong, and it was the sort of mistake a registrar might do. So you could go back and refine the training at the beginning. So the truth standard of the human segmentation, we adjusted, and it was especially about the basal slice. So we went through this iteration 4 times, and once this was doing nothing that didn't look like a human would do, we used 2 holdout data sets, one from Pittsburgh, prediction, prognosis, and one of this precision data set, and we found that this was superhuman. In fact, the precision was 50% greater than a human. Now, many people find that quite difficult to understand, but if you run a scenario for yourself for a moment. If you have 3 cases in front of you, one a terrible ventricle, one a borderline ventricle, and one a completely obviously normal ventricle, you definitely do not spend as much time on the very good and the very bad ventricle. You spend your time trying to work out which side of a line the borderline one is. And if attention is something to do with quality, you clearly are not doing the same quality across the thing. And we all get tired, and we have biases and things. This is sort of contours this AI tool will draw. And I like it if someone shows you things when they've gone wrong. And you can see that these contours are very, very good until it gets to no heart left, and then the breast implant, which has some sort of heterogeneity, it's gone wrong there. So about 1 in 450 contours is wrong. Another example is here. So artifact, which you'd never seen. You could do that, but the machine hadn't seen it before, so it got confused. Here it's decided that the thrombus is part of the muscle, which, you know, it isn't, but you can see that these are plausible errors, and they're explicable errors, interestingly. So how do you measure performance? I alluded to precision and prognostication. So we scan patients twice like that. There's 2 scans there with 2% difference in each time. And these are the performances. You can see that the machine learning, if you do the same images, is non-stochastic, so you can't do that. You have to give it test-retest. And when we do that, these are the performances. And you can see if you take EF that 6% variation to 4.2, that's actually quite a big difference, because the difference squares for minimal detectable change or for power calculation. So that would be it's actually about a 49% fewer subjects if you were doing a drug study, if you used AI. The outcome, we went to a 3rd center, Pittsburgh, and got their patients, 1,277 of them, where we knew their hospitalization. Pittsburgh people, apart from Zhao, don't move around very much. They stay there, so we got them captured. Only 2 health systems there, so you can get full follow-up on them. 29% event rate. And these were the performances. And the overall model was better. The AI model was better than EF, and your EFs will have been used in this, Zhao. With one exception. Can you see the exception? And that is that the human EF predicted better than the machine EF. And yet the human EF was with worse precision than the machine. So how could you have better prediction from EF and yet worse precision? And if you also look, there's something called the myocardial contraction fraction. Have you ever heard of that? So EF is stroke volume over EDV. So how much dilatation, Starling's law, remember, do you need to squirt, you know, a mil of blood around the body? The myocardial contraction fraction is how many grams of muscle for the same thing. It's exactly the same phenomenon, but EF was the thing that you could measure with ventriculography in the 60s. And that's why we use EF, but it's not sacred. And here, myocardial contraction fraction beats it. And we know EF doesn't work for diseases like HFpEF, and yet MCF does. So interesting that the AI is allowing us to reflect on what we do and how the heart works, and allows us to challenge assumptions that may be very set in stone. So we'll come back to that EF again, have a look at that. This is a sort of distribution of the EFs measured by the machine and by humans. And what you see is that humans distort the curve at 55% and 35%. And that distortion is probably them looking, and that distortion results in better prediction. And we think what's happening is that humans are looking at the whole, the effusions, the story, the stiffness of the heart and other features, and just giving the heart an ejection fraction to change the care pathway. So if you're a computer scientist, your doctors are not doing what you think they're doing. They're actually trying to get through a day, through a list, and tell other people who they work with to make the right decisions. They're not just measuring the EF. How would that change things? Well, this is a patient of ours with cardiotoxicity. So she's got breast cancer which can't be cured, and it's HER2 positive, so she needs her Herceptin and cardiac monitoring. And these are episodes of imaging EFs done by echo and CMR, and you can see here that her EF falls to 46%. And then 25%, and they stop the chemo. And then it gets better to 58 and then 57, and they restart. It's not really chemo, is it, Herceptin? But we'll call it chemotherapy for a moment. And then it happens again, and it happens again. But what you can see here is that each time to stop the drug, it takes the doctor 2 episodes, 2 measurements before they stop the drug, and 2 to start the drug again. That's what you do all the time. So your imaging departments are burdened by doctors trying to deal with the imaging department's uncertainty of measurement. And if we could get better precision, that would cascade through to point of care, and we could halve the number of tests we did, and then stop the chemotherapy at the right time and start it at the right time. Because in this interval here, the patient was risking irreversible cardiac damage, and in this interval here, the patient had metastatic cells growing unnecessarily. And then in time future, autonomous scanning will get better as well. And we need some imaging biomarkers as well. What about wall thickness? So it's easy when the two lines are parallel, but which of those is the right way of measuring? Do you go at right angles to the outside or right angles to the inside? Pose the question a different way. If you measure at right angles here or at right angles on the epicardium, they're kind of the same distance, but if you do it here, they're not the same distance at all. This is quite a problematic geometry issue. But this has all been solved in neuro. So if we start looking at other disciplines using a Laplace equation, where you basically put a voltage across the two lines and draw the isovoltage lines and then go at right angles to each of those, and you create a unique map, and you can join the dots between the two sides and get a unique measurement. This is very established in gravity or in many areas of physics, but we just haven't done it in measuring wall thickness. So here's a heart. Where are you going to measure the wall thickness? I just want you to imagine for a moment. And you suddenly think about blood myocardial boundaries, and then you think, do you include the septomarginal trabeculation? What about the LV trabeculation? So we took these images, another bunch of perfect images, 60 this time, TestRetest, because we're going to use precision again, and got 11 international experts, one of which is in this room, and got them to measure. So here are 11 international experts. And these are all people who've published on HOCM and CMR. Every person has published. Some of them published dozens of papers. And you can see that some people measured 25 and some people measured 36. So these are proper guideline experts measuring, doing their best, but it's not really good enough. And you can see the measurements here. So here are test A from 11 people and test B from 11 people, how they measured. And this is the machine test A and test B with a much more coherent difference in this single anecdote case. But if you look at the wall thickness on these people, here are the 11 experts, and we are releasing to the 11 experts which one of them they are, but not who the other people are. And you can see that the machine AI approach doesn't beat an expert, it beats every expert, and it beats every expert by a huge distance. So we're doing quite well in the AI. This is initial papers coming through. We're probably doing about, I don't know, one a fortnight at the moment, or one a month probably at the moment. Everything we're going to be doing is going to be AI to get the basics, but that's not biology. So we've now measured the usual things better. Let's move on to biology rather than just structure and function. And here are some biologies that we can now measure with MRI. It's not a lot, 8. If you get a pathology textbook, there might be 300 different stains and patterns of myocardial biology, but it's a start. And you can see here that we're using different stains. So there's Picoseres red and Lassen strichrome and what's that, Prussian blue and Congo red. And they're different, and we're using different sequences to do those in different cameras. This is a electron microscope. So if we think about the layers of information we're going to need clinically, it isn't going to be one camera and one subtype like T1 mapping. We're going to need to have a multiple modalities tuned into the biology. And this is the sort of framework for pathological processes from a rare, clean monogenic disease. I like rare, clean monogenic diseases because they allow you to understand what the heart might do, and then you can look for those patterns in more complicated diseases. So cardiotoxicity, Fabry's amyloid iron, learn stuff there, move to DCMs and HOCMs, learn stuff there, and then move to heart failure, which is hard, for example. You can see that this cascades take a long time to get to heart failure and sudden death. And the idea in Fabry's of treating with enzyme only is very crude, isn't it? There's a lot more we could do to interact and intervene here. Here's one technique we'll be using, T1 mapping in 2 flavors, chocolate vanilla, or at least native T1 and then ECV. And you can see normal has a range. And some of the diseases are outliers like amyloidosis, Fabry's iron, but many of them overlap. But if you take one of those parameters here, you can start to learn what they look like, and you can see a normal here, and this heart's gone blue except for the back, which is red. That heart's blue, that heart's red. And you can start to get good at this. In fact, you can also see your traditional metrics like asymmetry here. So this is looking very HOCM-y. Whatever I tell you, it looks like HOCM, not sort of infiltration. So you need to use your initial knowledge and then overlay it with more knowledge. And you start to see what the etiology is. And you can shave off, like, you know, Parmesan in a restaurant, some of the diseases and choose specific therapies for those diseases. But you can also see that some diseases like hypertension and HOCM are resistant to this initial approach. We're going to need new approaches. And if you're going to use these techniques in clinical practice, you have to standardize them globally. And we started to do this. So we made a Phantom, FDA CE mark approved Phantom. One of my fellows did that. It's quite good for a research fellow to get an FDA approved, commercially GMP produced medical device. And here is the variation from a hardware perspective of different scanners. Less than 1% is good. And you can see that some of the scanners are not good. So there's some work to do. But we're measuring these things and are able to standard things for global rollout. And here are measurements by different techniques. And if you use the Phantom, those techniques overlap again, as you can remove that error and get to what the biological variation is rather than the measurement variation. That was MRI, but it's not just MRI, it's other techniques as well. And you've seen some AS amyloids or amyloid marketing outside. And we're seeing amyloid in a lot of the patients, older patients here with TAVR. We find 1 in 7, in fact, in our service have amyloid. We have to have a roadmap for that from single center, multi-center, collaborations, registries. Here are some initial successes on this area. Some of them are Zhao's, some of us ours. We're starting to work together. Zhao is working with one of my team to create an international registry. And we think we'll get to 500 AS amyloid TAVR patients within a year or two. We've currently got 170, I think. And this is a roadmap, so most of these are published, but this one is this one was accepted in European Heart Journal this week, and this one was submitted yesterday. What about the circulation? So we talked a bit about myocardium and things. Circulation is important. We've shown that. We're starting to do this inline on the scanners, measuring flow in mils per gram per minute in the myocardium. This is available here in Minneapolis at João Cavalcante Center, one of about 15 in the world that can do this. And each pixel is flow in mils per gram per minute. And stress is at the top, rest underneath. This is healthy. And this is someone with 2-vessel disease. And you can see it so quickly. And this is microvascular disease. This is an apical HOCM. And you can see that the perfusion is very low at the apex at stress. In fact, it goes lower than normal. So vasodilator stress and the flow can actually be lower than normal. We don't fully understand why. Is that shunting? I don't think so. Is it sustained systolic contraction? Is it bridging? We need to find out more. In fact, we've just shown that this perfusion changes happen before hypertrophy. So most of us think that hypertrophy is the primary process in HOCM. How can the microvascular disease, microvasculature, which do not express sarcomeric protein mutations mainly, change before the myocytes are measurably changed? It comes back to what I talked about earlier about frameworks for understanding disease with cardiomorphogenesis and that pair of cells, the myocyte and capillary. And we've shown that the capillaries are abnormal in utero. So take diseases back sometimes to how the heart was built and we may get better insights. But now we can measure this with no ionizing radiation in vivo. And we're using AI for this in multiple points on the pathway, hence that circulation paper coming out on Valentine's Day, on the 14th. So that's a bit of biology. We're trying to reach more patients as well. These are some principles we're trying to do. I think a lot of our patients with devices are missing out. So we've got this campaign, MRI My Pacemaker, joining cardiology and radiology together. We have a mission that patients with cardiac devices should have the same access to MRI as anyone else. And that's the legacy devices as well. So this is a campaign nationally. We've improved access 4-fold nationally from 1,000 patients a year in the UK, terrible, should be 50,000. And in 3 years, we've gone to 4,000 a year, should be 50,000. So no room for complacency. Many US towns and cities are not able to scan your ICDs. If you put it in for primary prevention, indication, and yet now they have cancer and need an MRI scan for their chemotherapy, diagnosis, etc. But there's no reason we can't scan these. It's just about getting together cardiology, radiology to deliver this. It's not mainly cardiac imaging, but we do cardiac imaging, and we're starting to get rid of the artifact. This was our first case when we had a new sequence that we sort of commissioned. The artifact was completely covering the heart, and afterwards you see the thrombus in the LV apex. Pretty case, but we got that sequence written in 2 weeks and deployed within 2 weeks. From request to doing, in this case, was going for a left-sided VT ablation that afternoon. And I don't think that would have gone well with that unrecognized thrombus. So we're also trying to reach new patients, make these things faster, quicker, and easier. So I do that in the low middle income countries because there's an absolute need. If you haven't got much money for your services, the tendency is to cut the imaging and the diagnostics and then mistarget your expensive but limited therapies to the wrong patients, which does no one any favors. So we've cut MRI down to 20 minutes with contrast and 10 minutes without contrast, and done that in about 15 countries. The next ones are, I'm going to India on the 15th of March to 6 centers, and we've got Chile in July. We've done Cuba, I'm going back to Cuba, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Sri Lanka, and etc. There's some courses. And finally, I've been quite imaging focused, but actually those biomarkers, your heart is dissolving into the blood all the time, and there are signals we can pick up. And this was a process of trying to go beyond BMP and troponin, but rejecting the current approach of taking messy disease like heart failure and looking for signals in the periphery, and instead taking biopsies and looking for the signals in the tissue in clean phenotype diseases, and then seeing if we can transfer them. And here we found that a panel of 6 biomarkers in a drop of plasma could diagnose HOCM. And the panel correlated with things like wall thickness and risk. So I think we will be augmenting imaging with better and more sophisticated proteomic-based blood tests. I like proteomics because it's about what's there now, and the genetics are there all your life. But the proteomics, some of them are unique from myocardium, give you very clean signals. So I'm going to summarize this. We have a problem in cardiology. It's convenient not to notice it, but we'll do better if we do. We are falling behind others. Our imaging is not as good as we like to think. We waste a lot of our time because that uncertainty cascades through healthcare. Every one of you has tried to explain uncertainty to your patients every day. And I've given you a framework for thinking about the heart. You remember that energy stuff and structure and scale. I've highlighted one area, AI, and I've given you some links to some YouTube videos to start, if you want to start learning that. People need to, if you want to be in control of the future and make the future. And I've shown you some ways of thinking about how we might reach more patients and connect together and do more with less. And I've highlighted some frontiers there and hope over time to transform care. Thank you very much.
Outstanding. Questions from the audience? John.
Fantastic, thank you. How much of AI and other kinds of automated approaches are you taking clinically now? Where is that in your world?
So I want doctors to operate, or people to operate at the limits of their capability, as you say, at the top of their license. It takes time to get this into healthcare. I showed you some nice EF stuff, pretty basic task, segmentation, but it's a first step. And that is kind of ready to roll out if we know the route to roll out. So I've got a team of actually salesmen coming to SCMR next week, so we can start to work out how we deliver that to point of care and be as generous as we've got to engage with enterprise and industry. Capitalism works, and I'm an academic, I don't understand that. So we have to have other people to do this because these tools are fragile and they're going to need money to maintain them, but not so much money that they don't get global access. So there's some dilemmas to resolve there. But that's just the first step. we will be using that EF tool for all our research from now on, going forwards. My aim is that it would be unethical not to. I think we can get to that point. The AI quantification is used in all our cases, so 20 cases a day are with AI inline on the scanner. That EF tool is now on our scanner, so you don't even have to draw the contours at all. They're coming out of the scanner, but we have to do some work to make those contours editable. We want the contours drawn because we need explicable AI, and then we want to start annotating them and then decision support. And the thing I want most is interval change. And then with interval change, we can say, I think this heart has changed by 8%. My confidence, the AI tool confidence that that change is real is 98%. And then if you want, you can go to decision support. If you integrate what's wrong with the patient and start making suggestions. So this is really coming. The rollout is slow, but we're assembling the teams and the data sets to do this.
Is AI being used for image acquisition, to improve image acquisition?
Yeah, absolutely. So you want to do more quicker and sparse sampling of images. AI can help reconstruct. There are problems. So the algorithms can hallucinate structures that are not there because it's trying its best. We hallucinate edges that are not there on echo, very common. You measure wall thickness, you can't see the epicardium, you guess where it is from the rest of the heart. But we have to learn and understand when that is happening. So AI is like electricity. It's going to be in the background of everything we do, and it's important for us to understand when it's being used, have the frameworks to inform people when these complex nonlinear approaches are being done to make sure that we don't get misled. But we're using it in the image acquisition right now, for example. And echo is coming too, of course. The problem with echo is that MRI and CT is, the images are all in one Cartesian coordinate frame. So the 4-chamber and 2-chamber, you know exactly where they are. Every time you take the probe off, it's a new scan. So you just have to put some additional steps in the framework for that.
And I think that's coming too, I think, from the echo. Go ahead, James.
I'm just curious about your thoughts on measuring microvascular obstruction, and has such important prognostic implications. And you showed us the hazards of measuring like ejection fraction and wall thickness. Are those same caveats apply to MBO as you looked at that?
So MBO as in an acute infarct.
Right.
Yeah, so I talked initially about the microvascular function, but MBO is when the microvasculature is not functioning at all because it's been occluded or destroyed, etc. We don't see as much of it as 10 years ago because of prompt ambulance services, recognition by society, and primary PCI services. It is a phenomenon that is linked to bad outcomes and adverse remodeling. And it's well visualized. We just don't know. The problem is it's quite easy to measure things that predict outcome. What you want to do is measure things that predict outcome and then change that outcome through the linking of the imaging to therapy. And I don't quite know what therapy is to do that. There have been a number of studies. So MBO measurement has been standardized, and there have been a number of studies looking at adjunctive therapies in primary PCI to reduce MBO, but I'm not sure if any of them have been.
How can we scale this? How can we promote? How can we make this technology to become much more accessible to those that need?
Yeah, so the Medicare data from 2017 was that the US did 27,800 CMRs. My service does 9,000 a year. 7,000. You are the wealthiest country in the world. That is, why do you not want to use this technology? And the answer, you know the answers. There are lots of issues around fee per service and buying equipment. And your cardiology, radiology fights are existential. Who is a radiologist in this room? So why are you not got radiologists in this room?
Actually, I can tell you why. Because they went to London, got trained, and then they didn't make enough money for their group, and radiologists are no longer a part.
So you need to make more money. You either need to do them faster or cheaper. More for less is about. But actually, the other thing is that it takes time and to be trusted by the people giving the therapy, and the therapy has to be tied to that imaging. And the nice thing about MRI is it makes healthcare much more nuanced, you know. And there are, we talked about stress here, but things like the Menorca patients, the chest pain, troponin positives where the coronaries do not explain, everyone should have a cardiac MRI, because it's not a big deal to put someone on aspirin and statin and call them an infarct and stop them getting a loan for their house and things in the scheme of things, but it is for the patient. And if you can say, you had an episode of myocarditis, it's very trivial, don't worry about it. You had Takotsubo, we absolutely know that, don't worry about it. Actually, there was a flush occlusion, that is significant, it could have been dissection, we can talk about what that might mean. These things matter. So troponin elevation, normal coronaries is not a diagnosis. VFRS out of hospital is not a diagnosis. You know, there are lots of heart failure is not a diagnosis. So this gets you closer to precision therapy.
Scott.
Along those lines, is there any opportunity for MRI to help us understand the physiology of this myocardial injury phenomenon that we're seeing?
Absolutely. And, you know, we start to have terms about that, like area at risk and microvascular obstruction. And the basic techniques of late GAD get used a certain way, but in many ways, I want to know about the myocytes outside the area and what's happening to them. What I really want to know is what myocytes will be dead in the future. That's the, actually, the things I really want to know is I want to know myocyte size. We have no measure of that. I want to know the energy needed to do contraction and do a ratio of energy out in the circulation to myocardial energy. Now I don't know how to do that. And I want to know what, I want to subclassify the adaptive processes in myocardium. Because your myocytes, they may not be dividing, but they are sensing their environment. Most of our diseases are diseases of age. So something is changing, and they are very adaptive. And if something is sensing the environment, you can treatments for it and subclassify diseases. So subclassifying processes and diseases, giving us a new lexicon, is really going to be important. And MRI is the best of the techniques available, but it needs to be integrated.
Jay.
So we have a strong interest in cell therapy post-MI here, and then I'm looking at all your measurements, and the variability of all the parameters we're measuring is probably greater than our therapeutic response. I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on what we should be measuring? Should we just be measuring like strain, or is there anything, what would you recommend to show a therapeutic benefit? What should we really be measuring?
Yeah, so the first thing is that thinking about what you're measuring is really important, because obviously the best way to get published is to use a variable test and do 20 different studies, and then one of them statistically will get in automatically. So there is... You think that's ever happened? But acknowledging error is really sources of errors and bias and is really important. And we need to measure more than one thing, because yes, you want to know if there's been an efficacious effect on the patient, but if there isn't, you want to also know whether there are some biological signals of other effects that may target. Did you give too many cells, too few cells? What are they doing, etc. I do find cells amazing, but it's sometimes hard for me to imagine that injecting some cells into the myocardium or down a coronary they will just sort themselves out and do things. It does seem like a goal to achieve, but I struggle to fully understand it. Good, because some people get too believing in what we do, and you can see that my whole approach to medicine is quite skeptical. If you want to be doing something in your career, especially academically, you want to be on an exponential curve. So what you do now is at a scale that in the future is vastly eclipsed. And if you make concept errors and mislead yourself early, the consequences can be very grave. So keeping that open mind as to what we're doing and defining resource allocation of yourself and other people in the future by not making type 1, type 2 errors is really important. I don't have the answers.
Great lecture. You talked about how physicians seem to have discretion around some of these endpoints, EF for 55 or 35. AI doesn't seem to have, or doesn't have that ability. Are we going to have to change some of our standard cutoffs or clinical cutoffs?
So the other thing about these is that how those cutoffs were made is sort of 10-year-old echo. Do you think your echo now measures the same as it did? I mean, many of those EFs made it to, it might have been at the time harmonics were coming in and stuff. So these drifts make a big difference. And if you imagine a Gaussian distribution with a mean and say a risk cutoff with 5% above it or 2.5% above it, and you move the mean by half a standard deviation, which we might be doing all the time, you can double the area that you treat very, very easily. So we should be redefining and rebasing all the time. And one of the nice things about the AI is you can tip into it your healthy volunteers or your hypernormal healthy volunteers with normal ECG, no drugs, or population representative. I'm never sure which it should be. And those cases can be kept in there. So every time the AI is better, the reference range tracks that and stays relevant and true. And if you have a cohort of Black people or Hispanic or whatever it is, you can have more personalized reference ranges. So one of the things I want to do is move from a reference range of normal for people like me to normal for me. So I want to link the EPIC electronic health record to the scanner at the back end so that the reference ranges can integrate some of that data. That's a challenge we're looking at the moment.
Dali?
Excellent talk. One question regarding ACD. I figure out actually, especially have subcutaneous ICD is very problematic. How did you tweak your scanner to get the suitable?
Yeah. So in musculoskeletal and things, they're always dealing with metal, and they have that strategy called metal artifact reduction strategy, MARS. And so we were doing some of that. So we're changing the cines to spoil gradient echo. So there's some geeky stuff, and we're doing wideband and for the inversion recovery. It can get rid of the vast majority of the artifact. The sub-Q ICDs are often at the back, and the array can go around the front. So you will get some artifacts still in the ones I've seen around a couple of segments of the heart, but mainly you get rid of it. It obviously depends on the size of the patient as well, and some of the devices are more and less problematic. In fact, some of the manufacturers have twice as much artifact as others, for example. But we can mainly do it.
Excellent. Well, I thought there was a lot of interest. Thank you so much for coming.